In 1997, a neuroscientist at the University of California, San Diego, hooked electrodes to the skin of an epilepsy patient, flashed the word God on a screen, and watched the man's nervous system erupt. Not for violence, not for sex, for the divine. Your brain has circuitry that responds to the sacred. It's real, it's measurable. And in 2021, researchers at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston pinpointed exactly where it sits, buried in one of the oldest, most primitive structures you own. For decades, the assumption was simple. Belief is cultural. You inherit it from your parents, your community, your Sunday school. Religion is software, installed from outside, running on generic hardware. That's what most people still think. It's wrong. What neuroscience has found across brain scans, lesion studies, epilepsy wards, and radioactive tracer imaging is that your brain is structurally organized to produce spiritual experience. Not metaphorically, physically. Specific regions light up, specific regions go dark. Specific circuits activate in measurable, repeatable patterns whenever a human being reports feeling connected to something greater than themselves. This isn't about whether God exists. No brain scan can answer that. What the research answers is a different question entirely, one that may matter more to your daily life than any theological argument ever could. The question is this: why does your brain do this at all? Why would evolution wire a 3-pound organ, whose only job is to keep you alive long enough to reproduce, with dedicated hardware for transcendence? Why would natural selection preserve a circuit that makes you feel at one with the cosmos, when that feeling has zero survival value? Some scientists dispute this framing entirely, arguing that the spiritual response is merely a byproduct of other cognitive abilities. Others believe it was directly selected for because it strengthens social bonds within groups. The debate is unresolved. But the anatomy is not debatable. The wiring is there. You were born with it. And what happens inside that wiring, especially after age 50, is something almost nobody talks about. Start with the man who found it first. V.S. Ramachandran, neuroscientist, University of California, San Diego. In the late 1990s, Ramachandran kept noticing something strange in his epilepsy clinic. About 1 in 4 of his patients with temporal-lobe epilepsy, a condition where electrical storms erupt in the brain's temporal regions, near your ears, reported profoundly spiritual experiences during their seizures. Not confusion, not hallucination, not random firing. These patients described a sudden, overwhelming feeling that they understood the meaning of the entire cosmos. Some felt a presence in the room. Some described it as God, and these experiences were so powerful they changed the patient's entire lives. Between seizures, some became obsessed with religious thought, writing endlessly about meaning, about purpose, about the divine. Ramachandran wanted to test this. He used a tool called the galvanic skin response, 2 small electrodes on your fingertips that measure tiny changes in electrical conductivity. It's an indirect measure of emotional arousal. When your brain registers something significant, your palms sweat, just slightly, and the machine picks it up. Here's how it works for most people. Flash a violent image, conductivity spikes. Flash a sexual word, spike. Flash the word God, or show a religious icon, nothing much happens. It's neutral. Now here's what happened with the temporal lobe epilepsy patients. Violence, flat. Sex, flat. The word God, massive spike. Religious imagery, enormous response. Their brains had flipped the hierarchy of significance. The things that normally trigger emotional arousal did nothing. The sacred set them on fire. Think of it like a radio. Your temporal lobe is the tuner. In most people, it's set to pick up standard signals, threat, reward, social cues. But in these patients, the dial had been cranked to a frequency that most brains receive only faintly. The signal was always there. The temporal lobe just amplified it. Now, Ramachandran was careful. He tested only 2 patients. He said himself that no conclusions could be drawn from so small a sample. But the implication was enormous. If seizure activity in a specific brain region could selectively enhance spiritual feeling while suppressing other emotional responses, that meant the brain contains specialized neural pathways whose activation corresponds to religious experience, not a single God module. Ramachandran was clear about that, but something more distributed, a set of circuits whose normal function includes, or at minimum enables, the experience of the sacred. And he wasn't the only one looking. At Laurentian University in Canada, a neuroscientist named Michael Ferguson took this further, and his method was far more controversial. Ferguson built a device, a modified snowmobile helmet fitted with electromagnetic solenoids positioned over the temporal lobes. The press called it the God helmet. Beginning in the early 2000s, Ferguson reported that when subjects sat in a darkened, soundproof room wearing this device, which produced magnetic fields roughly 1,000,000 times weaker than a standard MRI, approximately 80% reported sensing a presence beside them. Some described it as another consciousness. Some described it as angelic. A few described it as God. The research is still evolving on this. A 2005 replication attempt by a Swedish team at Uppsala University failed to reproduce the effect under double-blind conditions. They concluded that the experiences were driven by suggestibility, not magnetic stimulation. Ferguson contested their methodology. The scientific community remains divided. But here's the part nobody mentions. Whether the God helmet itself works or not, the underlying observation has been confirmed by multiple independent researchers. The temporal lobe is deeply involved in spiritual experience. That's not in dispute. What's in dispute is whether you can trigger it with a magnet the strength of a telephone handset. The real question is what else your brain does beyond the temporal lobe when you feel something sacred. And the answer to that came from a radiologist in Philadelphia who started injecting nuns with radioactive chemicals. Andrew Newberg, University of Pennsylvania. He spent over 2 decades scanning the brains of people in the middle of spiritual practice. Tibetan Buddhist monks meditating, Franciscan nuns in deep prayer, Sikh chanters, Pentecostal speakers in tongues. His tool of choice, SPECT imaging, single photon emission computed tomography, which tracks blood flow through the brain in real time. What Newberg found was not one God spot, it was a network, a shifting dynamic pattern of activation and deactivation that changed depending on the type of spiritual practice. But one finding appeared again and again. During the deepest moments of meditation and prayer, the moments when subjects reported feeling at one with the universe or in the presence of God, blood flow dropped sharply in one specific region, the posterior superior parietal lobe. Newberg and his colleague Eugene D'Aquili called this area the orientation association area. It's the part of your brain that tells you where your body ends and the rest of the world begins. Think about that for a moment. Your parietal lobe is constantly drawing a boundary. This is me, that is not me. It uses sensory input, touch, vision, proprioception to construct that map every second you're alive. Without it, you wouldn't know where your arm stops and the chair starts. Now imagine you cut the input. You sit in silence. You close your eyes. You focus inward on a word, a prayer, a breath, so intensely that sensory data stops flowing to your parietal lobe. The region keeps trying to draw the boundary between self and world, but it has no data to work with, so the boundary dissolves. And what you feel, according to Newberg's subjects, is a sudden, profound sense that you are not separate. You are not contained. You are everything. That's not poetry. That's hemodynamics. Measurable blood flow changes in a brain structure responsible for self-orientation. If you've ever sat quietly and felt, even for a second, like the edges of yourself softened, like the distinction between you and the room became less solid, this is what was happening inside your skull. Your parietal lobe was losing its grip on the boundary, and in that gap, something vast rushed in. Newberg scanned the Franciscan nuns and found the same parietal deactivation. But the nuns also showed increased activity in the inferior frontal lobes and the language areas, consistent with verbal prayer. The Tibetan Buddhists showed increased frontal activation too, but with a different pattern, more focused, less linguistic. Each practice sculpted a different neural signature, but the parietal silence was the constant. Depending on who you ask, this proves one of 2 things. Either spiritual experience is generated entirely by brain mechanics, a product of your neural architecture with no external source, Or the brain is a receiver, and these regions are the tuning mechanism for something that exists independently of your neurons. Neuroscience, as Newberg himself has stated repeatedly, cannot distinguish between these two possibilities. If this is making sense, and you want the third part of this, the part about what a 2021 brain circuit study revealed in the most primitive region of your brain, subscribe now, because that section is coming in about 4 minutes and it changes the entire picture. What Newberg proved is that spiritual experience is not random, not pathological, not the mark of a disordered mind. It is patterned, it is reproducible, and it involves some of the deepest, most fundamental structures your brain possesses. But none of that prepared the scientific community for what came next, a discovery that moved the God spot from the top of the brain to the very bottom, to a place so old it predates human consciousness itself. In 2021, Michael Ferguson and a team of researchers at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston published a study in the journal Biological Psychiatry that did something no one had done before. They didn't scan people during prayer. They didn't stimulate temporal lobes. They studied what happened to spiritual belief when parts of the brain were destroyed. Their subjects? 88 neurosurgical patients who had brain tumors removed. Before and after surgery, each patient answered questions about spiritual acceptance. Ferguson then used a technique called lesion network mapping to see which brain circuits were disrupted by the tumor and how that disruption correlated with changes in belief. The results were staggering. 30 patients reported a decrease in spiritual belief after surgery. 29 reported an increase. And when Ferguson mapped the lesion sites, they all converged on a single circuit. Not in the temporal lobe, not in the parietal lobe, in the periaqueductal gray. The periaqueductal gray, or PAG, sits deep in the brainstem. It is one of the most evolutionarily ancient structures in the human brain. It exists in nearly identical form in reptiles, birds, and mammals. It is so old that it predates the cerebral cortex by hundreds of millions of years. This is not a thinking structure. This is a survival structure. It modulates pain. It triggers the fight or flight response. It mediates fear conditioning. And, this is critical, it has been independently linked to altruistic behavior and the experience of unconditional love. What almost nobody talks about is this. The spiritual circuit in your brain is not located in the regions responsible for abstract thought, memory, or language. It is rooted in the same architecture that controls whether you feel pain, whether you flee from a predator, whether you bond with your offspring. It sits at the base of everything. Stop and read that again. The brain circuit most associated with spirituality is centered in a structure that you share with a lizard. Not in the sophisticated neocortex, not in the regions that make you uniquely human, in the part that makes you simply alive. Ferguson validated his findings with a second dataset, over 100 combat veterans with penetrating head injuries from the Vietnam War. The results held. Lesions that disrupted the PAG circuit changed religious belief. The circuit was real, it was consistent, and it was ancient. Our results suggest that spirituality and religiosity are rooted in fundamental neurobiological dynamics and deeply woven into our neurofabric, Ferguson said. He added, "We were astonished to find that this brain circuit for spirituality is centered in one of the most evolutionarily preserved structures in the brain." Historians still argue whether this implies that spiritual experience was selected for by evolution, serving a direct survival function by strengthening group cohesion, or whether it's an accidental byproduct of circuits built for pain modulation and bonding. Pascal Boyer, an anthropologist at Washington University in St. Louis, argues the latter, that religion is a byproduct of cognitive capacities that evolved for other purposes. Others, like David Sloan Wilson, argue that religion itself was the adaptive advantage. The data don't settle it. But the data do confirm one thing. The capacity for spiritual experience is not cultural decoration. It is biological infrastructure. It lives in the part of your brain that was built before you could think, before you could speak, before you could imagine. So the question becomes, if your brain has this built-in mechanism, this circuit that connects pain, love, fear, and the sacred into a single ancient network, how do you activate it? And more importantly, what happens to this circuit as you age? Here's what the research points to, not speculation, not opinion. Practices that have been shown in imaging studies, in controlled trials, in decades of clinical observation, to engage the neural circuitry associated with spiritual experience. Step 1. Focused attention meditation. 15 to 20 minutes daily. Sit in silence, eyes closed, and direct your attention to a single point. Your breath, a word, a short prayer. Hold it there. When your mind wanders, return. Newberg's SPECT scans show that after approximately 12 minutes of sustained focused attention, blood flow to the posterior parietal lobe begins to decrease. That's the boundary dissolving effect. That's the self-other distinction softening. You don't need a monastery. You need a chair and a timer. Dr. Newberg at Thomas Jefferson University has documented this protocol's effects on practitioners over 60 since the early 2000s. The key variable is consistency, daily practice over weeks, not the intensity of any single session. Step 2. Controlled breathing, specifically an extended exhale pattern. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 8. Repeat for 5 minutes before your meditation. This activates your vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in your body, running from your brainstem directly through the periaqueductal grey region Ferguson mapped. Vagal stimulation has been shown to reduce sympathetic nervous system activity and shift the brain toward a parasympathetic state, the state in which spiritual experiences are most frequently reported. You cannot access the deep circuits while your threat detection system is running at full volume. The exhale turns the volume down. Step 3. Awe exposure. This one surprises people. A 2015 study from the University of California, Berkeley, led by psychologist Dacher Keltner, found that experiences of awe, standing before something vast, complex, or incomprehensible, shift neural processing away from the default mode network. The default mode network is the brain system most associated with self-referential thought, the inner monologue, the constant narration of me. Awe quiets it. The mechanism is similar to what Newberg observed in the parietal lobe during meditation, a reduction in self-oriented processing. For practical purposes, this means spending time in nature, watching storms, looking at the night sky, listening to music that gives you chills. These are not luxuries. They are neurological inputs that your spiritual circuitry requires. Step 4. Social bonding rituals. The PAG, the brainstem structure at the center of Ferguson's spirituality circuit, is also a hub for attachment behavior. Singing in groups, chanting, communal prayer, and synchronized movement all activate overlapping neural pathways. A 2016 Oxford University study by Robin Dunbar found that group singing elevated pain thresholds more than solo singing, a direct marker of endorphin release mediated through brainstem circuits. If you want to activate the God circuit, do it with other people. If even one of these steps was new to you, hit like. It tells the algorithm to show this to more people who need it. Step 5. Gratitude practice before sleep. Not a list, not a journal. A deliberate 3-minute mental exercise where you recall one specific moment from the day and re-experience it with full sensory detail. Newberg's research suggests that this kind of emotionally engaged reflection activates the frontal limbic connection, the same pathway seen in his nun scans during deep prayer. Your brain does not distinguish clearly between reliving a meaningful moment and having a spiritual experience. The neural signature overlaps. Here's what this comes down to. For centuries, we argued about God as if the question lived only in philosophy, in scripture, in faith. We treated belief as something that happened above the neck, in the realm of ideas, of arguments, of choices you make with your rational mind. The neuroscience says otherwise. Your capacity for the sacred does not live in your intellect. It lives in the same tissue that manages your pain. That triggers your fear. That bonds you to your children. It is as old as the brain stem, older than language, older than thought, older than anything you would call you. That doesn't diminish it. If anything, it elevates it. It means that when you feel something you can't explain, a sudden stillness, a fullness, a sense that you are part of something enormously larger, your brain is not malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as it was built to function. The circuitry is there. It was always there. Most of us just stopped activating it. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment, even a brief one, where you felt the boundary between yourself and the world disappear? Where did you feel it? In your chest? In your head? In a place you can't name? I'd bet most of you have experienced this, but never connected it to your brainstem. Here's what I'd leave you with. Newberg, Ramachandran, Ferguson, they can tell you what your brain does when it touches the sacred. They can map it, measure it, photograph the blood flow. What they cannot tell you, what no scan will ever tell you, is whether the signal your brain is receiving originates inside the skull or outside of it. That question remains open. Your brain doesn't invent the sacred, it receives it. Share this with someone who needs it, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you should. What's coming next week is something I've been researching for months. There is a circuit in your brainstem older than your ability to doubt it. It is running right now. It has been running since the day you were born. The only question that science cannot answer, and may never answer, is what it's connected to on the other end. And maybe that's the point.